They called it the Jug, a nickname born from disrespect. When American pilots first laid eyes on this massive fighter plane in 1942, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was enormous, ungainly, and looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never seen a fighter aircraft before. The sleek Spitfires and nimble Messerschmitts seemed like ballerinas compared to this heavyweight champion. At over 17,000 pounds fully loaded, it was one of the heaviest single-engine fighters of the war. But what those young pilots didn't know yet was that they were looking at the machine that would change the course of the air war over Europe. This is the story of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, America's forgotten masterpiece that became one of the most feared Allied fighters in the sky. Picture this. It's early 1943, somewhere over Nazi-occupied France. P-47 Thunderbolts are flying some of their first combat missions, escorting B-17 bombers deep into enemy territory. The pilots are nervous. They've heard the stories about the legendary German aces, about the speed of the Focke-Wulf 190s, about how the Luftwaffe owns these skies. Captain Don Blakesley, leading one such formation, scans the horizon with experienced eyes. He's already a veteran, having flown Spitfires with the RAF, and he's skeptical about this new American bird beneath him. It's heavy, it's big, and right now, climbing to altitude, it feels sluggish. Then the radio crackles. Bandits. 12 o'clock high. A formation of Focke-Wulf 190s is diving toward the bombers, their yellow nose cones gleaming in the thin sunlight. This is it. The moment of truth. Blakesley pushes the throttle forward, and something incredible happens. That massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine roars to life with 2,300 horsepower. The P-47 doesn't just accelerate. It rockets forward like it's been shot from a cannon. In the dive, the Thunderbolt reaches speeds no German fighter could safely match. The Focke-Wulfs scatter, completely unprepared for this American monster bearing down on them. But let's go back to the beginning, because this aircraft almost never existed. The story of the P-47 starts in 1940, in a modest office in Farmingdale, New York, where a brilliant but stubborn engineer named Alexander Kartveli was staring at a serious problem. The United States Army Air Corps wanted a new fighter. They wanted it fast, they wanted it maneuverable, and they wanted it to carry heavy armament. Easy enough, except for one small detail. They also wanted it to fight at 30,000 feet, where the air is so thin that conventional engines gasped for breath like drowning men. Kartveli knew that the only solution was a turbo supercharger. This marvel of engineering would compress the thin high-altitude air, feeding the engine enough oxygen to maintain full power even in the stratosphere. But there was a catch. The turbo supercharger was enormous, weighing hundreds of pounds, and it needed complex ducting to function. Most designers would have tried to minimize this, to tuck it away and keep the aircraft small and nimble. But Kartveli looked at the problem from a completely different angle. If the turbo supercharger had to be big, then the whole aircraft would be big. And if it was going to be big anyway, why not make it indestructible? The result was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. The P-47 weighed 12,000 pounds empty. When fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and bombs, it tipped the scales at over 17,000 pounds. To put that in perspective, it was twice as heavy as a Spitfire and heavier than most other single-engine fighters. Some critics called it the flying bathtub. Others said it would never work, that it was too heavy to dogfight, too big to be agile. But Kartveli had built something far more important than a nimble dancer. He'd built a survivor. The fuselage was built like a tank. Where other fighters had thin aluminum skin, the P-47 had layers of armor plating protecting the pilot from every angle. The seat was armored. The canopy frame was reinforced. Even the engine was protected by thick steel plates. But the real genius was in the details. Kartveli had studied the combat reports coming from Europe, and he knew that most fighters were lost not to direct hits, but to damage that cascaded into catastrophic failure. A single bullet through a fuel line could doom an aircraft. A severed control cable meant certain death. So Kartveli built in redundancy. The fuel system was self-sealing, with multiple tanks separated by fireproof bulkheads. The control cables were duplicated and routed through different parts of the aircraft. The massive radial engine, that Pratt & Whitney R2800, was an air-cooled design. Unlike the liquid-cooled engines in German fighters, which would seize up if a single coolant line was punctured, the R2800 could lose 3 or 4 cylinders and keep running. Pilots would eventually bring home P-47s with half the engine shot away, the propeller still turning. But the critics weren't wrong about one thing. At low altitude, the P-47 was indeed sluggish. In the thick air near the ground, it couldn't turn with a Messerschmitt or climb with a Focke-Wulf. Early pilots who tried to dogfight at low altitude often paid with their lives. It took time and painful lessons before they figured out how to fight in the Thunderbolt. The key was altitude. Up high, where the turbo supercharger came into its own, the P-47 was a completely different beast. At 25,000 feet, it could outrun anything the Luftwaffe had. And when it dived, it was unstoppable. The tactics evolved quickly. P-47 pilots learned to fight vertically instead of horizontally. They would patrol at high altitude, using their superior speed to choose when and where to engage. When they spotted enemy fighters below, they would dive at tremendous speed, make a single high-speed pass, and then zoom back up to altitude using all that momentum. The Germans called it boom and zoom, and they hated it because there was nothing they could do about it. By the time they turned to chase, the Thunderbolt was already 2 miles away and climbing. But the real revelation came when someone had a crazy idea. What if we used this indestructible fighter as a ground attack aircraft? In early 1944, as the Allies prepared for D-Day, P-47s were increasingly tasked with strafing and bombing missions. They would sweep in low over occupied France, their 850 caliber machine guns tearing apart trains, trucks, and German positions. Each gun fired 800 rounds per minute. That's 6,400 bullets every 60 seconds, a devastating storm of firepower that could disable locomotives, shred armored vehicles, and destroy rail traffic. The German troops on the ground called them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, and they feared them intensely, because you could hide from bombers in shelters and bunkers. But the Jabos came in low and fast, appearing out of nowhere, and nothing was safe. Pilots would come back with tree branches stuck in their landing gear, having flown so low that they'd clipped the treetops. They'd come back with bullet holes everywhere, hydraulic fluid leaking, engines smoking, and still make it home. One pilot, Robert Johnson, became a legend on May 26, 1943. His P-47 was jumped by German fighters over France and hit repeatedly. Cannon shells tore through the fuselage. The rudder was shot away. The canopy was shattered. Johnson himself was wounded, blood streaming down his face. Any other fighter would have broken apart. But the Thunderbolt held together. Johnson managed to dive away and head for England, the aircraft shaking violently, barely controllable. When he finally crash-landed at his base, the ground crew counted over 200 bullet and shrapnel holes in the aircraft. The engine was still running. Stories like this spread quickly through the squadrons. Pilots who had initially resented being assigned to the heavy, ungainly Thunderbolt began to appreciate what they had. This wasn't a sports car. It was an armored personnel carrier with wings. It wouldn't dance around enemy fighters, but it would bring you home when everything went wrong. And gradually, something remarkable happened. The kill ratios began to shift. By mid-1944, P-47 squadrons were achieving air superiority over Europe. The vaunted Luftwaffe, which had seemed invincible just 2 years earlier, was being ground down. German pilots, already depleted by years of combat, found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't shake and couldn't escape. The P-47s flew higher, dove faster, and absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any other fighter. And there were so many of them. Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale was turning out Thunderbolts at an incredible rate, hundreds per month. The numbers tell a story of industrial might that the Germans simply couldn't match. From 1942 to 1945, Republic built 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts. To put that in perspective, Germany built about 34,000 Messerschmitt 109s over the entire war. But Germany was also building dozens of other aircraft types, spreading their resources thin. America could focus its massive industrial capacity on a handful of proven designs, and the Thunderbolt was one of them. But this wasn't just about quantity. By 1944, the P-47 had evolved into the D model, which addressed its one remaining weakness: range. The early Thunderbolts could only escort bombers partway into Germany before they had to turn back for fuel. German fighters learned to wait until the escorts left before attacking the vulnerable bombers. But the P-47D carried additional fuel in conformal tanks fitted under the wings, and with external drop tanks, it could fly deep into the heart of the Third Reich. Now there was nowhere safe for the Luftwaffe to hide. The impact on the ground war was even more profound. As D-Day approached, P-47s were flying thousands of sorties, systematically destroying the German transportation network in France. Trains couldn't move during daylight. Trucks were hunted relentlessly. Tank columns were strafed until they abandoned their vehicles and scattered into the woods. The German army's ability to maneuver, to respond to threats, to reinforce weak points, was crippled. When the invasion finally came on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was almost entirely absent from the skies over Normandy. The Thunderbolts and their Allied counterparts owned the air completely. One of the most devastating tactics developed for the P-47 was the armed reconnaissance mission. Flights of 4 to 8 Thunderbolts would patrol assigned sectors of occupied territory, looking for targets of opportunity. If they spotted a train, they'd destroy it. A convoy, gone. Even individual vehicles weren't safe. German soldiers learned to freeze when they heard the distant rumble of our 2800 engines, knowing that any movement could draw the attention of those deadly 8-gun fighters. The pilots who flew these missions lived on a knife's edge. Flying low and slow to attack ground targets meant exposing yourself to intense anti-aircraft fire. German flak was deadly accurate, and at low altitude there was no time to dodge. But the Thunderbolt's rugged construction saved countless lives. Pilots would return with flak damage that should have been fatal, with control surfaces blown off, with engines trailing smoke, and somehow the big fighter would keep flying. The ground crews developed an almost superstitious reverence for the aircraft, patching holes, replacing damaged parts, and sending them back into combat the next day. In the Pacific theater, the P-47 had a different but equally important role. While the P-38 Lightning and carrier-based fighters handled much of the air superiority mission, the Thunderbolt proved especially effective in certain island campaigns and ground support roles. The R-2800 engine's air-cooled design meant it was less prone to overheating in tropical climates. The rugged construction held up better on rough jungle airstrips. And when flying long over-water missions, pilots appreciated the knowledge that their aircraft could absorb battle damage and still make it home to a carrier or island base. But here's what really sets the P-47 story apart. This aircraft saved countless American lives not just through its combat effectiveness, but through simple survivability. Fighter pilots in World War II faced terrible odds. The average life expectancy of a new pilot in combat could be measured in weeks. But P-47 pilots had among the highest survival rates of any fighter pilots in the war. When you were hit, when everything went wrong, the Thunderbolt gave you a chance. It would absorb punishment that would obliterate other aircraft. It would fly on damaged engines, with holes in the wings, with controls shot away. Colonel Hub Zemke, one of the top P-47 aces, once said that the aircraft was like flying a comfortable armchair. It wasn't the fastest in level flight. It wasn't the most maneuverable. But it was honest. It didn't have vices or quirks that would kill you if you made a small mistake. It was stable, predictable, and forgiving. 4 young pilots with minimal training, thrust into the meat grinder of aerial combat, these qualities meant everything. As the war progressed into 1945, the P-47's role evolved yet again. With the Luftwaffe essentially defeated, Thunderbolts were used increasingly for ground support, working closely with advancing Allied armies. They would orbit over the battlefield, waiting for calls from forward air controllers, then dive down to hit German positions with bombs and rockets. The later models could carry up to 2,500 pounds of ordnance, as much as a medium bomber. Imagine a fighter that could carry that much firepower, deliver it with precision, fight its way through enemy fighters, and then return safely to base. The final major variant, the P-47N, was designed specifically for the Pacific Campaign and the planned invasion of Japan. It had extended wings for better range and high-altitude performance, and it was intended to escort B-29 superfortresses all the way to Tokyo and back. The war ended before the P-47N could prove itself in this role, but the very fact that such an aircraft existed speaks to how far the Thunderbolt concept had evolved from that original ungainly prototype. By the time the guns fell silent in August 1945, P-47 Thunderbolts had flown more than 546,000 combat sorties in Europe alone. They had destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. They had obliterated countless trains, trucks, tanks, and installations on the ground. And they had brought home thousands of American pilots who, in any other fighter, would have died over enemy territory. Yet today, when people think of World War II fighters, they usually think of the Spitfire or the Mustang. The P-47 has been largely forgotten, relegated to a footnote in history. Perhaps it's because the Thunderbolt wasn't beautiful in the classical sense. It didn't have the graceful lines of the Spitfire or the sleek profile of the Mustang. It was big, brutal, and businesslike. Or perhaps it's because the story of the P-47 doesn't fit the romantic narrative of aerial combat, the image of knights jousting in the sky. The Thunderbolt was more like a linebacker than a fencer, winning through toughness and determination rather than elegance. But the men who flew it knew the truth. They knew that Alexander Kartveli's ungainly creation was a masterpiece of engineering, a perfect balance of firepower, protection, and performance. They knew that when everything went to hell, when you were alone over Germany with your aircraft shot full of holes and enemy fighters closing in, there was no aircraft you'd rather be flying than a P-47 Thunderbolt. It earned its reputation one mission at a time, one battle at a time, one pilot brought safely home at a time. The Wehrmacht had learned to fear many things by 1945. The Soviet tank armies, the Allied naval power, the unstoppable industrial might of America. But perhaps nothing symbolized the loss of air superiority quite like the sound of our 2,800 engines overhead, the sight of those big, tough fighters diving out of the sun, and the knowledge that there was nowhere left to hide. The age of the Luftwaffe was over, and the Thunderbolt had played a crucial role in ending it. That ungainly jug, that 7-ton brute that everyone thought was too heavy to succeed, had dominated the skies over Europe and the Pacific. It had done exactly what Alexander Kartveli designed it to do. It had fought, it had survived, and it had won. And then, like so many tools of war, it was quietly retired and forgotten by all but those who had flown it and those who had feared it. But the story deserves to be remembered, because the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't just another fighter plane. It was proof that sometimes the unconventional approach, the design that breaks all the rules, can be exactly what's needed. It was proof that survivability matters as much as performance. And it was proof that American engineering and industrial might, when fully mobilized, could produce weapons that would change the course of history. The Thunderbolt may be forgotten, but its legacy lives on in every military aircraft designed with pilot survival as a priority, in every rugged attack aircraft that prizes toughness over elegance. It was, quite simply, a masterpiece. And now you know its story.